The day my sister called to announce she was pregnant with triplets, my mother didn't even wait for the call to end before she turned to me and said, "Well, you're not doing anything important anyway. I'm Maya. I'm 26 years old. I have a full-time job, a lease I pay for myself, and a life I built quietly and carefully after years of being treated like the family's spare part. I don't have a husband. I don't have children. And apparently in my parents' eyes, that means I have nothing. Nothing that couldn't be dropped, nothing that couldn't be sacrificed, nothing that mattered more than what my sister needed. So they volunteered me. No conversation. No question. No, Maya, would you be willing? Just a family group chat notification at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. Maya will move in with Priya and Daniel to help with the babies. We already told them. It's settled. 3 babies. Someone else's babies. A life I never agreed to. I stared at that message for a long time. Long enough to feel the familiar heat crawl up the back of my neck. The same heat I'd felt at 16 when they gave Priya the college fund they'd promised me. The same heat at 22 when they missed my graduation because Priya had a gender reveal party that weekend. It was always something with Priya. And it was always somehow my job to disappear so she could shine. But this time was different. Because this time, they had no idea what I'd been building in the silence they'd created around me. They didn't know about the promotion. They didn't know about the savings account. They didn't know about the apartment I'd just put a deposit on, 2 cities away, or the life I was 3 weeks from stepping into. They thought I was still the Maya who said nothing. The Maya who absorbed it. The Maya who showed up anyway. They were wrong. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you exactly what I said in that family group chat and what happened at Priya's baby shower 6 weeks later when I finally walked in, I need you to understand how we got here. Because this story didn't start with triplets. It started the day my parents decided one daughter was worth everything, and the other was worth whatever was left over. I want to stop right here for a second. Because before I take you back to the beginning, before I show you the full picture of what my family put me through and exactly how I dismantled it, I need to know something. Are you still with me? If you've ever been the one in your family who gets volunteered, the one who gets voluntold, the one who somehow always ends up holding the weight nobody else wants to carry, while the favorite child floats through life on a cushion everyone else stitched together, then this story is for you. If you've ever sat with your phone in your hand, reading a message that casually rearranged your entire life without asking if you were okay with it, and felt that specific suffocating mix of rage and exhaustion and not again, then you already know exactly how I felt on that Tuesday night. And you deserve to see how this ends. So before we go any further, do something for me. Hit the like button right now. Not for the algorithm, for every version of yourself that stayed quiet when you should have walked away. For every time you showed up for people who never once showed up for you. This one's for us. And if you're new here, welcome. Subscribe because the stories I tell on this channel are for the ones who were never supposed to win. The overlooked ones. The ones who got the $2 lottery ticket while their sibling got the savings bond. The ones whose achievements were always somehow less impressive, less urgent, less worthy of attention. I see you. And I want you to stay. Drop your location in the comments too. Seriously, I want to know where in the world you're watching from. Every time I post, people from places I've never even dreamed of visiting show up in those comments. And it reminds me that this experience, being made to feel like the family's afterthought, is not a personal failure. It is not a reflection of your worth. It is a pattern. It is a dynamic. And it is more common than anyone wants to admit. Now, let me tell you about Priya. My sister is 2 years older than me and she has been, for as long as I can remember, the sun our entire family orbited. Not because she demanded it, though she did eventually learn to expect it, but because my parents decided early on, in ways so subtle they probably never even said it out loud to themselves, that she was the one worth investing in. She was prettier, they thought. More sociable. More likely to produce the kind of life my parents could brag about at church and at dinner parties and at every family gathering where reputations are quietly constructed and destroyed. I was the other one. The serious one. The one who read too much and talked too little and didn't smile the right way in photographs. The one who got good grades but somehow that was never quite as exciting as whatever Priya was doing at the time. I don't say this for sympathy. I've done enough therapy and enough journaling and enough 2 a.m. conversations with myself in the dark to know that my parents' limitations are not my identity. I know that now. But I didn't know it then. And for a long time their version of me was the only version I had access to. So I shrunk. I accommodated. I made myself useful in the ways I was allowed to be useful. Quietly, efficiently, without asking for recognition. I became very, very good at disappearing inside a room full of people who were supposed to love me. And I told myself that was just how families worked. I told myself that until the night I was 23 years old, sitting in a hospital waiting room alone, after a minor procedure my parents didn't come to because Priya had a dinner reservation she'd been looking forward to. That was the first crack. Not the break. Not yet. But the first real crack in the version of myself that believed on some stubborn, aching level, that if I just kept showing up, kept being useful, kept being low maintenance, kept being good, eventually they would see me. That night in the waiting room I started to understand something important. They were never going to see me, so I was going to have to make them. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the dramatic beginning. Not the group chat message, not the baby shower, not the moment everything finally broke open. The quiet beginning. The one that looks from the outside like a perfectly normal family. We lived in a 4-bedroom house in a suburb that was nice enough to feel safe but not nice enough to feel remarkable. My father worked in logistics. My mother did administrative work part-time and spent the rest of her energy managing the social architecture of our family. Who we were to the neighbors, to the church, to the extended relatives who visited twice a year and needed to leave impressed. Image was everything in our house. Not in a loud, obvious way. In the way that certain things were simply never discussed. In the way that my mother's face would go very still when something threatened the version of us she had carefully constructed. Priya fit that version perfectly. She was warm in the way that photographs well. Quick to laugh, easy to hug, the kind of person who made adults feel interesting just by paying attention to them. By the time she was 12, she had already mastered the specific performance of being a good daughter. And my parents rewarded her for it in ways so consistent they became invisible. They just felt like love. For Priya things appeared. A new outfit before the school dance, offered without asking. Extra tutoring when her grades slipped, arranged without drama. When she wanted to join the expensive travel volleyball team at 15, there were 2 weeks of discussion. Serious, considered discussion, before my parents found a way to make it work. I watched all of this from a slight distance the way you watch weather through a window. Not quite inside it. Not quite outside it either. I wasn't treated badly. I want to be precise about that because the most insidious kind of favoritism is the kind that leaves no bruises. Nobody hit me. Nobody told me directly that I was loved less. What happened was quieter than that and in some ways harder to name, which meant it was also harder to defend against. What happened was that Priya's needs were urgent and mine were not. When Priya needed something, the family reorganized around it. When I needed something, there was a conversation about whether it was really necessary. Whether I was being realistic. Whether I had considered the cost, not just financial cost but inconvenience cost, attention cost, the cost of shifting focus away from wherever it currently lived. I remember being 14 and asking my mother if I could join the school debate team. The practices were on Thursday afternoons. My mother's response was immediate and mild. That might be too much on your plate, Maya. You don't want to stretch yourself thin. Priya joined the volleyball team, the drama club, and the student council that same year. Nobody mentioned her plate. I remember being 16 and receiving a letter from a summer academic program. A competitive, fully subsidized program for students with demonstrated aptitude in sciences. I left the letter on the kitchen counter, the way Priya left things she wanted my parents to notice. It sat there for 4 days. Nobody mentioned it. I eventually threw it away. I remember my 17th birthday falling on the same weekend as Priya's regional volleyball tournament. My parents drove 3 hours to watch her play. They left me $40 on the counter and a note that said, "Celebrate with your friends. Love Mom and Dad." I didn't have plans. I spent the evening watching television alone and telling myself it was fine. It was fine. It was fine. It was not fine. But here is the thing about growing up as the unfavored child in a family that is not overtly cruel. You don't get a clean narrative. You don't get a villain who twirls their mustache so you know exactly what you're dealing with. What you get is a slow accumulation of moments, each one small enough to dismiss, each one leaving just enough room for you to wonder if you're being oversensitive. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they're just tired. Maybe Priya really does need this more than I do. Maybe I'm making this into something it isn't. That internal negotiation becomes second nature. You become fluent in excusing the people who should have known better. And the longer you do it, the more it starts to feel like your own personality, like you are simply someone who doesn't need much. Someone who is fine on their own. Someone who has reasonable expectations. It took me years to understand that I hadn't been born with low expectations. I had been trained into them. The golden child dynamic in our family crystallized fully around the time Priya turned 18. That was the year my parents sat us both down. This is one of the few times I can remember a formal family conversation, and explained that they had been saving for college. They were proud of this. They had worked hard and they wanted us to know they had been thinking about our futures. They had enough for one full ride. They had decided it would go to Priya. For me, they said there were loans. There were scholarships I could apply for. There were work-study programs. They said this with the particular confidence of people who believe they are being practical rather than cruel. My father actually used the phrase, "We know you're resourceful, Maya," as if my resourcefulness were a gift they had given me, rather than a survival skill I had developed because they kept withdrawing. I was 16 when they had that conversation. Priya was 18 and already accepted to a university 3 states away. I sat at that kitchen table and I nodded and I said I understood, and I watched my mother look relieved that I wasn't making it difficult. I went to my room and I sat on my bed and I made a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not a declaration. Just a quiet internal shift. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but that changes the direction of everything that comes after. I decided I was going to build something they couldn't give and couldn't take away. I didn't know what that looked like yet. I was 16. But I felt it settle into me like a stone dropping to the bottom of still water. Something solid. Something mine. I studied harder than I had ever studied. Not to impress them. I had mostly stopped needing their approval by then, or at least I had learned to function without it. I studied because I understood finally and completely that my future was not going to be handed to me. That was painful. But it was also, in a strange way, clarifying. When there's no safety net, you stop looking down. I applied for 11 scholarships my senior year. I received 4. Combined with federal aid and a part-time job, I worked 20 hours a week through my entire undergraduate degree. I put myself through a state university and graduated with a degree in business administration, a 3.8 GPA, and approximately $6,000 in debt, which I paid off inside 2 years. My parents came to my graduation. They arrived 40 minutes late because of traffic and left immediately after the ceremony because my mother had a headache. They took 2 photographs. In both of them I am smiling. Priya's graduation 2 years earlier had been a weekend event. My parents rented a house near the campus. Extended family flew in. There was a dinner at a restaurant that required reservations 3 weeks in advance. My aunt made a slideshow. I told myself I was past caring. I was not past caring. But I was getting better at converting caring into fuel. At taking the ache of being consistently underestimated and using it to stay awake 1 more hour, send 1 more application, push 1 more time when stopping would have been easier. By the time I was 24, I had a job I was good at and a small apartment I paid for without help and a therapist I saw every other Thursday who was slowly helping me understand that what had happened in my family was not a series of coincidences or misunderstandings. It was a pattern. It had a name. And I was allowed to be angry about it. I was also finally starting to understand that my anger didn't have to be loud to be real. Didn't have to be destructive to be valid. Could just exist, clean and honest and mine, while I decided deliberately what I wanted to do with it. I was still working that out when my phone buzzed on a Tuesday night at 11:47, and everything that had been building for 26 years finally found its moment. But before we get there, before I walk you through exactly what happened next, you need to understand one more thing. You need to understand Priya's wedding. Because that's where it stopped being background noise. That's where they crossed a line I hadn't even known I'd drawn until they stepped over it. And that's where the version of Maya who said nothing and absorbed everything and showed up anyway. That version finally, quietly put down everything she'd been carrying. And walked out the door. Priya's wedding was in October. She had been engaged for 14 months by that point. 14 months of planning that had, in the way most things in our family did, gradually absorbed everyone's energy, attention, and emotional bandwidth until there was very little left over for anything else. My mother had a binder. An actual 3-ring binder with color-coded tabs. She carried it to Sunday dinners. She referenced it in casual conversation. She spoke about floral arrangements and reception timelines with the focused intensity of someone managing a military operation. I was a bridesmaid. Of course I was. Declining would have been a declaration of war, and at that point I was still operating in the mode I had perfected over 2 decades. Present, cooperative, and carefully, quietly contained. I bought the dress. Sage green off-shoulder $240 that I was told would be reimbursed and never was. I attended the bridal shower, which was held at a venue my mother had rented and decorated herself, and which had a custom neon sign with Priya's name on it. I sat in the 3rd row of chairs and clapped and smiled and handed Priya gifts she unwrapped without looking at the cards. I did what I always did. I showed up and I disappeared at the same time. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday evening at an Italian restaurant my future brother-in-law Daniel's family had chosen. It was warm and crowded and smelled like garlic bread and expensive candles, and for the first hour it was almost pleasant. I sat between 2 of Priya's friends from university who were friendly enough, and I drank a glass of wine and told myself this was almost over. Then my father stood up to give a toast. I want to tell you that I was prepared for what he said. I want to tell you that after 26 years, I had sufficiently calibrated my expectations to absorb whatever came next without flinching. But there is a particular kind of pain that is worse precisely because you should have seen it coming and you almost did and you still weren't ready. My father is not an eloquent man. He speaks in short, declarative sentences, and his emotional register is narrow but sincere. When he is proud of something, you know it. It comes through in the straightening of his posture, the slight increase in his volume, the way he looks around the room to make sure everyone is paying attention before he says the thing he wants witnessed. He stood at that rehearsal dinner and he talked about Priya for 7 minutes. 7 minutes about her warmth, her resilience, her capacity for love. He talked about watching her grow into a woman who knew her own worth. He talked about the day she was born and the moment he understood what it meant to be a father. His voice cracked twice. My mother pressed a hand to her mouth. Half the table was crying before he finished. And then he said, and I am going to give you his exact words because I have replayed them enough times that they are permanently transcribed in some back room of my brain. He said, and of course thank you to Maya for being here. That was it. Thank you for being here. Not a reflection. Not a memory. Not a single specific thing about who I was or what I had contributed or what it had meant to have me as a daughter for 26 years. Just, thank you for being here. The kind of thing you say to a neighbor who helped with parking. The kind of thing you say to someone whose name you almost forgot. I smiled. I picked up my wine glass. I did not let my face do anything it wasn't supposed to do. But something shifted in me at that table that I couldn't shift back. The wedding itself was the following afternoon. It was beautiful, genuinely. The venue was a restored farmhouse with string lights and long wooden tables and late-season flowers in amber and cream. Priya was radiant. Daniel looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. I stood at the altar in my sage green dress and held her bouquet while she said her vows, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, I don't resent her. And that was true. It had taken me a long time to get there, but it was true. Priya was not the architect of our family's dynamic. She had been placed at the center of it before she was old enough to choose, and she had simply grown into the space she was given. That's what people do. What I resented was the architecture. The reception moved the way receptions do, in that slightly surreal blur of champagne and music and people you half know saying things you immediately forget. I made conversation. I danced once. I ate most of my dinner. And then my mother found me near the edge of the dance floor and said in the bright, efficient tone she used for logistics, "Oh, Maya, we're going to need you to take the centerpieces home tonight. We rented the vases and they need to be back by Monday. You have your car, right?" I did have my car. I had driven 40 minutes to be here. I was in a formal dress and heels and it was 10:30 at night. "Sure," I said. She was already turning away before I finished the word. I loaded 11 flower arrangements into my car that night. Alone in the parking lot in the dark while the reception continued inside without me. I made 4 trips. On the 3rd trip, I passed a window and could see the dance floor. My parents in the center of it, laughing, my father's hand on my mother's back, Priya spinning in her dress with her arms raised. I stood in that parking lot on my 4th trip and I looked up at the sky and I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I let myself feel it. All of it. Without immediately folding it into something manageable. Without telling myself it was fine or that I was overreacting or that at least they meant well. I let it be what it was. It was grief. Specific and long overdue. The grief of understanding fully and finally that the parents I had needed had not been available. That they had been right there. Physically present, not malicious, not monsters. And still somehow fundamentally absent in the way that mattered most. That I had spent the better part of my life adjusting myself to fit a space that was never actually made for me. I drove home that night with 11 flower arrangements in my back seat and a decision forming somewhere below conscious thought, the way the most important decisions do. I was not going to do this anymore. Not loudly. Not dramatically. I wasn't going to send an email or start a confrontation or call a family meeting. I wasn't wired for that, and honestly it wasn't what I needed. What I needed was to stop being available for things that cost me and gave nothing back. I started small. I began not answering every phone call immediately. I stopped rearranging my schedule when something came up last minute that was really just someone assuming I had nothing important going on. I started treating my own time with the same seriousness I had always extended to everyone else's. It was uncomfortable in the way that all boundary setting is uncomfortable when you've spent your whole life without any. My mother mentioned twice that I seemed distant. My father said nothing, which was his way. Priya, to her credit, called me once, 3 months after the wedding, and asked if I was okay. It was the closest either of us had come to a real conversation in years. And for a moment I almost said it. Almost opened the door. But she was 3 weeks pregnant at that point, though she hadn't told anyone yet. And the life I was being carefully, deliberately built was still fragile enough that I wasn't ready to risk it on a conversation I couldn't control. So I said I was fine. That I'd just been busy. And she said, okay, in a way that suggested she didn't entirely believe me but wasn't going to push. That was October. By February everything would change. Because in February, Priya called my parents with news that would, in their minds, solve a problem they hadn't even identified yet. And in their solution they had once again volunteered someone who was not them. Let me tell you what my family didn't know about me. Not because I had been deliberately secretive, though I had, to some extent, learned to keep my life close. But because somewhere along the way they had stopped asking. When you are designated the low-maintenance one, people take you at your word. They stop inquiring. They assume that no news is good news and that your silence is contentment rather than what it actually is. Which is someone who learned early that her news wasn't particularly interesting to the people she most wanted to share it with. So they didn't know. They didn't know that 18 months after Priya's wedding, I had been promoted twice at the logistics consultancy where I'd worked since graduating. They didn't know that the second promotion had come with a salary increase significant enough that I had quietly, methodically eliminated the last of my student debt, funded a 6-month emergency reserve, and started contributing the maximum allowable amount to my retirement account, all before my 25th birthday. They didn't know that I had spent the better part of 2 years building a freelance client base on the side, small and medium businesses that needed operational process work, the unglamorous infrastructure stuff that nobody thinks about until it breaks. I was good at it. Genuinely good. The kind of good that comes not from talent alone but from years of being the person who figures out how to make things work with whatever is available. They didn't know that I had recently signed with a small business partner. A woman named Renata, 10 years older than me, sharp and exacting, and the first professional I had ever met who reminded me of myself. And that together we had incorporated a consulting LLC that was, by the time Priya's Triplet announcement arrived in my phone, generating enough monthly revenue to cover my rent twice over. They didn't know that 3 weeks before that Tuesday night group chat message, I had placed a deposit on an apartment in a city 4 hours away. A city where Renata was based, where our client concentration was highest, where I had already quietly begun the process of transferring my life. The apartment had south-facing windows and a second bedroom I intended to use as an office and a building that allowed dogs, which mattered because I had been thinking seriously about getting one. They didn't know any of this, because they had never asked. I want to be careful here because I'm aware of how this part of the story can sound. I'm aware that there's a version of it that becomes about money, about financial victory as the ultimate proof of worth, as if the goal all along was to accumulate enough to make the people who underestimated you feel small. That was never what this was for me. I have met people for whom the hustle is fundamentally about revenge, and I understand the appeal of that framing, but it doesn't hold up over time. Revenge is a terrible foundation. It keeps you oriented toward the wrong thing. What the work was actually about, what the late nights and the side clients and the careful, unglamorous accumulation of skills and savings and options was actually about, was freedom. Specifically, the freedom to say no. That is, I came to understand, the only kind of power that actually matters. Not power over anyone else. Not the ability to make someone feel what you felt. Just the quiet, solid, unassailable ability to decline. To opt out. To say this doesn't work for me and mean it and survive the consequences. I had been building that ability for years. Brick by brick, in the hours before work and after work and on weekends when I could have been doing something easier. Every client I landed, every process I documented, every invoice I sent and collected was another layer of structural support beneath a life that no one could volunteer me out of without my consent. I hadn't framed it that way consciously. Not yet. But that's what it was. The other thing they didn't know about was Dr. Okonkwo. I had started seeing her 3 years earlier, initially because my company offered 6 free therapy sessions as part of their benefits package, and I had a coworker who mentioned it so casually over lunch that it briefly seemed like a normal thing to do. I used the 6 sessions. Then I paid for more. And then more after that because something was happening in those 50-minute Thursday appointments that I hadn't experienced anywhere else. I was being taken seriously. Dr. Okonkwo had a way of asking questions that made you feel the shape of your own thinking. She didn't tell me what my childhood meant. She asked questions until I could hear myself saying it out loud, and then she let the silence sit while I caught up to what I just said. It was in one of those sessions about 18 months in that I said, without planning to, in the middle of talking about something else entirely, I think I've always believed that wanting things was a problem. She didn't respond immediately. And then she said very quietly, "Where do you think you learned that?" I knew the answer before she finished the sentence. You learn it when your wanting is consistently treated as inconvenient. When your needs are met with a slight pause, a gentle redirect, a practical reason why this particular thing isn't quite possible right now. You learn it when the person next to you wants freely and is met with immediate, enthusiastic mobilization, and the contrast is never explained, just lived. You absorb the lesson the way children absorb everything. Not through instruction but through the texture of daily life. Through what is celebrated and what is quietly managed. I had spent 23 years managing myself. Preemptively shrinking my wants so they couldn't be denied. It is an exhausting way to live, and the exhaustion is hard to identify because it feels so much like just being a responsible person. Dr. Okonkwo helped me understand the difference. By the time Priya called our parents with the triplet news, I had been in therapy long enough to know my own patterns. Long enough to recognize in real time what was happening when that group chat message arrived. Long enough to feel the familiar pull, the reflex toward accommodation, toward making it work, toward being useful at the expense of everything I had built, and to observe it without immediately obeying it. That was new. That capacity to pause between the trigger and the response. It sounds small. It was enormous. I read the message 3 times. Maya will move in with Priya and Daniel to help with the babies. We already told them. It's settled. I noticed the language. Well, not could. Not would you be willing to consider. Well, present tense declaration. A fact about my life, authored by someone else, delivered as a notification. I noticed the phrase we already told them. Meaning, the conversation that determined my future had already happened without me. I had not been a participant in the decision. I had been the subject of it. I noticed it settled. The door pre-closed. The assumption that I would receive this information and reorganize accordingly. That my life, my apartment deposit, my partnership, my south-facing windows, my carefully constructed freedom, was the kind of thing that could be overridden by a group chat message at 11:47 p.m. I put my phone face down on my kitchen counter. I made myself a cup of tea, which I do when I need to impose a small, deliberate ritual on a moment that's trying to become chaos. I sat with it, and I thought about everything I had built in the silence they had created. Every early morning and late night. Every client call and deposited invoice and therapy session and difficult conversation with myself. Every moment I had chosen quietly and without witness to treat my own life as something worth protecting. And I thought they have no idea. Not said with bitterness. Said with something closer to clarity. They had constructed a story about who I was and what I was for, and they had been updating it for 26 years without ever once checking it against reality. It was time for them to meet the current version. I picked my phone back up. But I didn't respond to the group chat. Not yet. First I called Renata. Renata picked up on the second ring. She had a habit of answering the phone as though she had been expecting your call specifically, regardless of the hour. It was one of the things I had come to rely on about her. That quality of complete, unhurried presence. She didn't say hello so much as she said your name, and the way she said it made you feel like whatever you were about to tell her was already being taken seriously. Why, I need to think out loud, I said. Go ahead. I read her the message. All 12 words of it. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her setting something down on a hard surface. Her coffee mug, probably, because Renata treated every serious conversation as something that required both hands free. When did they send this? An hour ago. And you haven't responded. No. Another pause. Then, good. Don't. Not tonight. That was the conversation I needed. Not permission. I hadn't needed anyone's permission for a long time. But confirmation that my instinct to slow down, to not react from the hot center of the feeling, was the right one. Renata had known me long enough to understand what this family cost me. She had heard enough Thursday morning debriefs after Sunday dinners to have a clear picture. She didn't editorialize. She just helped me think. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it I had a plan. Not a revenge plan. I want to be precise about that because the word revenge implies a level of premeditation and emotional investment in someone else's suffering that I genuinely didn't have. What I had was a response strategy. A clear, measured, adult response strategy for a situation that my family had created by treating me, once again, like a resource rather than a person. The first step was information gathering. I called Priya the next morning. This was deliberate. I did not call my parents. I called Priya directly, which immediately disrupted the chain of communication my parents had established by sending that group chat message. They had framed this as a done deal, a logistical arrangement already agreed upon between the relevant adults. By calling Priya myself, I was quietly signaling that I intended to be a party to my own life rather than a subject of it. Priya answered with the voice of someone who was either genuinely happy to hear from me or had been coached to sound that way. With Priya it was sometimes hard to tell, not because she was dishonest but because she had grown up in the same family I had and had her own complicated relationship with performance. Why? Did you see Mom's message? I did, I said. I wanted to talk to you directly. A slight pause. Oh. Sure. I asked her to tell me in her own words what she was hoping for. Not what our parents had arranged. What she, Priya, actually needed and wanted. I asked it plainly and without accusation, and the question seemed to catch her slightly off guard, which told me that the arrangement had been our parents' architecture more than hers. He talked for a while. About the pregnancy, which had been unexpected in its multiplicity. She and Daniel had been trying for one baby, and the triplet diagnosis had arrived at the 8-week scan with the particular brutality of news that is wonderful and terrifying simultaneously. About Daniel's job, which required travel 3 weeks out of 4 and showed no signs of changing. About the fact that her closest friends were in different cities and her mother-in-law had health issues that made extended caregiving complicated. He was scared. That came through clearly. Under the careful management of her tone, she was genuinely, deeply scared, and I felt for her in a way that was real and uncomplicated. 3 babies at once is a seismic life event under the best circumstances. I understood why she needed help. What I also understood by the end of that call was that she had not specifically asked for me. She had asked our parents for advice and our parents had provided a solution. And the solution, as solutions in our family so often did, had involved me without consulting me. Priya had accepted the solution because she was scared and it was offered with confidence and she had not thought to question whether I had been asked. "Do you want to do this?" she said near the end of the call. Her voice was quieter than it had been. I mean, do you actually want to? It was the most honest question she had asked me in years. Maybe ever. I want to help you, I said carefully. But I can't move in. I need you to know that and I need Mom and Dad to know that. I have a life that doesn't have room for that. But I want to figure out what I can actually offer if you're open to that conversation. Silence. Then, they said you didn't have anything major going on. There was. They said you didn't have anything major going on. I let that sentence exist in the air between us for a moment without immediately filling it. I had learned to do that, to let the weight of a thing settle before I responded to it because my first response was usually to smooth it over and my second response was usually more honest. I know that's what they said, I told her. That's part of what I'd like to talk about. We agreed to meet the following weekend. Just the 2 of us without our parents, which was itself a small act of structural rebellion against the way our family conducted its business. With our parents in the center, routing all information through themselves, maintaining the architecture by being its essential switchboard. In the days between that phone call and the weekend meeting, the group chat became active again. My mother sent a follow-up message asking if I had seen her original message. Then another asking why I hadn't responded. Then a phone call I let go to voicemail. The voicemail was 4 minutes long and covered in order. Her concern that I was upset about something, a reframing of the caregiving arrangement as a temporary and reasonable request, a reminder that family helps family, a brief mention of everything they had done for me over the years, and a closing note that she hoped I would call back soon because they were trying to finalize plans. I listened to it twice. Then I saved it because Dr. Okonkwo had taught me to document rather than immediately react. And because I had learned that having a record of how things were actually said, rather than how they would later be remembered, was a form of protection. My father texted separately. 3 words. Call your mother. I called her the following evening. I kept it short and warm and said I had been thinking about everything and that I wanted to have a proper conversation soon, and that I loved her, and I let her talk for 12 minutes about the triplets and the nursery colors Priya was considering and the fact that 3 babies would need 3 of everything, which she said as though the mathematics of it were themselves an argument for why I should agree. I said I understood. I said we would talk more soon. I did not say yes. That not yes was the most important thing I had done in years. Because every previous version of me would have already said yes by now. Would have found a way to accommodate. Would have started mentally rearranging my life before anyone had even asked me directly. The old Maya ran toward the ask before it was fully formed, because being useful before you were asked for felt like proof of worth, and I had been proving my worth to these people since I was old enough to understand that it needed proving. This Maya waited. And while I waited, something began to happen that I had not anticipated. My parents, accustomed to my accommodation, interpreted my non-response as processing time rather than resistance. They began making plans. My mother called Priya to discuss room arrangements. My father mentioned to his brother, who mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it at a family dinner I wasn't at, that Maya was going to help with the babies. It became in the family's shared narrative a settled thing. Which meant that when I finally said what I was actually going to say, at a Sunday dinner 3 weeks later with my parents and Priya and Daniel all seated at the same table, the contrast was going to be significant. They had built a story. I was about to introduce them to the facts. The Sunday dinner was my mother's idea. She framed it as a family celebration. Priya's pregnancy, the coming babies, a chance for everyone to sit together and talk through the logistics in a warm, united way. She made jollof rice and fried plantains and the pepper soup she reserved for occasions she considered significant. She set the table with the good plates. She lit candles. I arrived on time, which my family always read as a sign of cooperation. I brought wine, which my mother accepted with a smile and set on the counter without opening, which was her way of acknowledging a gesture without being distracted by it. Daniel was already there, seated at the far end of the table with the careful posture of a man who understood he was in someone else's theater. Priya was in the kitchen helping my mother, and when she saw me she gave me a look, brief, searching, that I returned with a small nod. We had spoken twice since our phone call. The conversations had been careful and honest in a way that our relationship had rarely managed before. She knew I wasn't going to agree to what our parents had arranged. She didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but she knew something was coming, and to her credit she had not tried to talk me out of it or warn our parents. She had simply shown up. That meant something to me. I filed it away. My father carved the chicken with the focus ceremony he brought to all physical tasks, and we filled our plates, and for the first 20 minutes it was almost ordinary. My mother talked about the nursery. Daniel talked about converting the home office. My father asked logistical questions in his clipped, practical way: square footage, proximity to a hospital, whether the building had an elevator. And then my mother set down her fork and turned to me with the warm, organized expression she wore when she was about to execute something she had rehearsed. "So Maya," she said, "we should talk about the timeline. We're thinking you'd move in around week 32 of Priya's pregnancy, so you're settled before the babies arrive. That gives you about 6 weeks to sort out your apartment situation." The table shifted slightly. Daniel looked at his plate. Priya looked at me. I took a sip of water. "I'm not going to be able to do that," I said. The quality of silence that followed was specific. It was the silence of a room in which something expected has not happened. My mother's expression didn't change immediately. It held its shape for a moment the way a structure holds its shape briefly after the foundation moves. "What do you mean?" she said. Her voice was measured. "Careful. I mean I can't move in," I said. "I have a lease deposit on an apartment in another city. I have a business partnership that requires me to be present and operational. I have a life that I've been building for several years that I'm not in a position to put on hold." My father put down his fork. "What business?" And there was the question that confirmed everything. Not, "What do you mean you can't?" Not, we should have asked you first, we're sorry. The first instinct was not concern or accountability. It was disbelief. The information that I had a business was, to my father, more surprising than the possibility that he had made a significant decision about my life without asking me. Renata and I incorporated a consulting LLC 18 months ago, I said. We work with small and medium businesses on operational process. It's been growing consistently. It's why I'm relocating. Our client base is concentrated there, and it makes more sense for me to be closer to it. My mother looked at me the way people look at a document they're trying to read in insufficient light. You never mentioned this. No, I said. I didn't. Why not? I considered the answer to that question carefully, because I had thought about it enough to know that the honest answer was layered and that not all of the layers were appropriate for a Sunday dinner table. Because I've learned, I said, that when I share things with this family, they tend to get factored into decisions made about me rather than celebrated. I wanted to build it far enough that it couldn't be managed before I said anything about it. The silence this time was different. Then, my mother said, "That's not fair." "Mom," I said, and I kept my voice even. 3 weeks ago you sent a group chat message at midnight telling me I would be moving in with Priya. Not asking. Telling. You said it was already settled. You told Priya and Daniel before you said a single word to me. You told Dad's brother, who told his wife, who apparently told everyone at a family dinner I wasn't invited to. And the reason none of that felt like a problem to you is because you have spent my entire life making decisions about my time and my availability and my future without checking whether I had any thoughts on the matter. Priya made a small sound. Not quite a word. My father said, "We were trying to help your sister." "I know," I said. "You're always trying to help Priya. What I'm telling you is that helping Priya by volunteering me, without asking, without considering that I might have something going on, without even the basic courtesy of a conversation, is not something I'm available for anymore." "Anymore," my mother repeated. Her voice had changed. Something behind it was starting to understand that this was not a negotiation. "What does anymore mean?" "It means this is a pattern," I said. "It's been a pattern my entire life. The college fund. Priya's graduation. My hospital appointment. The wedding centerpieces. It's always been some version of the same thing. My needs, my time, my life, treated as available for redistribution whenever it's convenient. And I absorbed it for a long time because I didn't have the language for it and because I loved you and because I kept believing it would eventually balance out. It didn't. And I'm not absorbing it anymore." My father's jaw tightened. "You're being dramatic." "I'm being accurate," I said. "Those are different things." Daniel, to his considerable credit, said nothing and looked at the wall with the focused neutrality of a man who had correctly identified that his job in this moment was to not exist. My mother's eyes were bright. "After everything we've done for you." "I know what you've done for me," I said. "I also know what you've done for Priya. The difference between those two lists is exactly what I'm talking about." "So what are you saying?" Priya's voice was quiet. She had been watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between distress and a complicated recognition. "You're just not going to help at all?" "I'm saying I can't move in," I told her, and my voice softened because this part was for her, not for our parents. "I'm saying I'm not available to have my life rearranged without being asked. But I also said on the phone that I want to figure out what I can actually offer, and I meant that. I love you, Priya. I'm going to be an aunt to 3 babies and I take that seriously. What I can't be is a solution that was decided without me." She nodded slowly. Her eyes were wet. My mother said, "I can't believe you're doing this at a family dinner." "You scheduled this dinner specifically to finalize the arrangement," I said. "I came to have an honest conversation. That's not the same thing as ruining dinner." My father pushed back from the table. Not dramatically, just the movement of a man who needed a moment and was taking one. He walked to the kitchen. I heard the tap run. My mother looked at me across the table with an expression I had never seen on her face before, or perhaps had never allowed myself to see. It was not anger exactly. It was something more unsettled than that. The look of someone encountering a version of a familiar thing that doesn't match the file they have stored for it. She had a file for Maya. She had been maintaining it for 26 years. The Maya sitting at her table did not match the file. I picked up my fork. I took a bite of jollof rice. It was, as it always was, excellent. My mother was a genuinely gifted cook, and that had always been true regardless of everything else. "The food is really good, Mom," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked down at her plate. And the table breathed again unevenly into whatever came next. The weeks after that Sunday dinner were not dramatic. I want to tell you that because I think there is a version of this story. The version the algorithm prefers, the version that gets the most comments, where everything that follows is a montage of consequence. Where my parents call repeatedly, increasingly desperate. Where Priya goes into labor and I swoop in heroically. Where my mother appears at my door with tears and a full apology, finally saying every specific thing I needed to hear, finally seeing me clearly after 26 years of selective vision. Some of that happened. Some of it didn't. And the parts that didn't are, in their own way, as important as the parts that did. What actually happened first was silence. My parents went quiet in the way that people go quiet when they are recalibrating rather than reflecting. Not processing what they had heard so much as deciding what to do with it. My mother did not call for 11 days. My father did not call at all, which was consistent with his general approach to emotional discomfort, which was to wait for someone else to resolve it. I used those 11 days well. I finished the paperwork on my new apartment. I had 3 calls with clients who were transitioning to the new service structure Renata and I had built. I packed the first third of my belongings into boxes that I labeled in the precise, slightly compulsive way I had always organized things, a habit I had once been mildly embarrassed about and had come to understand as one of my genuine strengths. I went to therapy on Thursday and told Dr. Okonkwo what had happened at the dinner table, and she listened with her particular quality of attention and then asked, "How do you feel about how you handled it?" "Proud," I said. And then, because honesty in that room had always been the point, and sad. "Tell me about the sad." "Because it needed to happen," I said. "And because needing to happen doesn't make it not a loss. I didn't want a family that required a confrontation. I wanted a family that didn't." She nodded. "You're allowed to grieve the family you needed while still holding the boundary with the family you have." I wrote that down. I still have it. Priya called on day 8. She called, notably, from her own phone, at a time when our parents were unlikely to be present, which told me she had made a deliberate choice to have this conversation separately. I answered immediately. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said." "Hey," I said. "The centerpieces thing," she said. "From my wedding. I didn't know about that. I didn't know you loaded them alone. Mom told me you offered." I said nothing. "She told me you offered," Priya repeated quietly, as though hearing herself say it twice was helping her understand something about the sentence. "I should have checked. I should have come to find you. You were at your own wedding," I said. "You were dancing." "I know. But I should have noticed you were gone." It was not a complete accounting. It was not the sweeping acknowledgement of everything that had been unbalanced between us for our entire lives. But it was specific and it was unprompted, and she had called me privately to say it, which meant she had chosen honesty over the easier path of family loyalty, and that choice cost her something. "Thank you," I said. And I meant it. We talked for an hour. Not about the triplets, not about logistics, not about what I was or wasn't going to provide. We talked about growing up. About the things we had each experienced in the same house and somehow never compared notes on. Priya said things I hadn't expected. About the pressure of being the favorite, which she had felt as its own kind of weight. About the performance of it. About how exhausting it had been to be the one everyone expected to shine, because it meant that every ordinary moment was a potential disappointment. I had not thought about it from that angle. Not seriously. I sat with it. I don't think Mom and Dad are bad people, I said eventually. Neither do I, she said. But I think they made us into a competition that neither of us agreed to enter. That was the most honest thing my sister had ever said to me. I told her so. She laughed, a short, surprised laugh, and said she'd been in therapy for 4 months and apparently it was doing something. We made a plan. A real one, built on actual conversation rather than group chat declarations. I would visit once a month for the first 3 months after the babies arrived. I would stay for a long weekend, not indefinitely. I would be Auntie Maya, present, consistent, genuinely invested, and not a live-in caregiver, which was a role that required hiring someone trained for it, which Priya and Daniel could afford and had simply not looked into because a free family solution had been presented first. Priya hired a night nurse 2 weeks later. And then a part-time nanny. She texted me after the nanny's first day. She's incredible. Why did we not do this from the beginning? I texted back. Because someone told you I was available. Then, yeah. My mother called on day 11. The conversation was not an apology. I want to be honest about that because I think you deserve an honest ending rather than a satisfying one. She did not sit down with a list of specific things she had done and work her way through them. That is not her language, and I have lived long enough with the gap between the apology I needed and the one she is capable of giving to understand that waiting for the former is a way of staying in pain indefinitely. What she said was, "I didn't realize you had so much going on." Which is not the same as "I'm sorry I didn't ask." But which is, for my mother, a significant concession. An acknowledgement that her picture of me had been incomplete, and that the incompleteness was a factor. "I know," I said. "I'd like you to ask going forward." Okay. It was small. It was real. I took it. My father has never directly addressed what happened at that dinner. He expressed his version of repair by calling me 2 weeks later to ask about the consulting business. Specific questions, practical questions, the kind my father asks when he is trying to demonstrate interest in a language he is more comfortable with than emotional acknowledgement. I answered them. We talked for 20 minutes. It was the longest conversation about my work we had ever had. I moved into my new apartment on a Thursday in March. The south-facing windows were exactly as good as I had imagined. The second bedroom became my office. I got a dog, a 3-year-old rescue named Clement, brown and white and deeply serious about his personal routine, which I respected. Renata and I took on 2 new clients in the first month. By summer we had a waiting list. I visited Priya in April when the triplets were 6 weeks old. I want to tell you about that visit because it was not what I expected, and the unexpected things are usually the ones worth telling. I expected it to be overwhelming. 3 infants in a house that smelled like formula and sleep deprivation, chaos in every direction. And it was that. But it was also something else. Priya handed me one of the babies, the smallest one, a girl they had named Adiz after our grandmother, and she was so light and so specific, this tiny particular person with her particular face and her particular grip, and I held her and felt something I hadn't anticipated. Not regret that I hadn't agreed to move in. Not guilt. Not the complicated weight of the family story I had been carrying since I was 14 years old. Her. Just this baby. Just the uncomplicated fact of a new person in the world who had nothing to do with any of the old dynamics and everything to do with what came next. I stayed the whole weekend. I helped where I could. I left on Sunday afternoon and drove 4 hours home with the windows down and Clement asleep in the back seat, and somewhere around the halfway point I realized I was okay. Not in the way you say I'm fine when you mean the opposite. In the way that is simply true. A quiet, sustainable okay. The kind that doesn't require anything from anyone. And so, if you have made it this far, I want to talk to you directly for a moment. Because I know why you're here. I know what it feels like to be the one who gets volunteered. The one whose life is treated as available, whose plans are treated as flexible, whose boundaries are treated as opening positions in a negotiation you never agreed to enter. I know what it costs to hold a boundary with someone you love. I know that it doesn't feel like winning. I know that the thing you actually wanted was never the confrontation. It was the family that made the confrontation unnecessary. That grief is real. You're allowed to feel it. And you're also allowed to build something they can't redistribute. Something that belongs to you entirely. Not as a weapon, not as proof, just as a life. Your life. The one you chose deliberately instead of the one that was chosen for you. That's what I did. And it was worth every quiet, unglamorous, unwitnessed hour it took to get here. If this story meant something to you, if you heard yourself somewhere in it, hit the like button. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and whether any of this landed. And if you have someone in your life right now who is treating your availability as a given, I want you to remember something. You are not a resource. You are a person. And the life you're building in the silence they created, they have no idea.